Welcome to everyone that's joining us right now. We're just going to take a few minutes as we wait for colleagues to sign in. Again, hello everyone. We're just taking another minute or two. There are still colleagues that are joining us on the call. And welcome to the webinar. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Name, organization, let us know where you sit in this conversation. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names. Welcome, everyone. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Shama and I'm the CALP network in MENA. And I will be your host for today. Before we kick off, I just want to let everyone know that there's a dual translation that you're able to access. So on the bottom of your right screen, there's a button for translation, for interpretation. Please select your respective language. I'm going to repeat this in Arabic right now. مرحبا وأهلا وسهلا فيكم جميعا. الأشخاص اللي بفضلوا الترجمة باللغة العربية في كبسة على الشاشة من تحت على اليمين للترجمة اضغطوا عليها ونقوا اللغة اللي بتفضلوا تكونوا عم تشاركونا اليوم. Next slide, please. So we're just going to go over a few housekeeping rules for the webinar. This event will go on for 90 minutes and it is recorded. There's a Q&A box that you will find at the bottom of your screen. So please use that to drop in any questions that you would like for us to address at the end of the webinar. And then you have the chat that's also available for general reflections and anything that you'd like to share. Your mics are muted, and in the case of a Zoom hacker, staff will remove and block the offender from this space. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. Again, we're looking at Lebanon. I'm going to first hand over to Celine to introduce herself from CAFA. Over to you, Celine.
بونجور أنا اسمي سيلين أنا على باز أسيستانت سوسيال واليوم بشتغل بكفا من 2012 أنا اليوم سبورت سنتر سوبرفايزر مسؤولة عن الخدمات الاجتماعية اللي بتتقدم لضحايا العنف اللي بيجوا لعنا على المكتب.
أهلا وسهلا فيك سيلين. Chantal, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chantal, and I'm the protection manager at DRC based in Beirut, Lebanon.
Nice to have you with us, Chantal. And last but not least, Wissam.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris, Chantal, and Salim. My name is Wissam. I'm the co-lead of the Tajassud Working Group in Kurras that works on trans-related issues in Lebanon. I'm also I've been organizing and activism for the past 10 years, and I also work in humanitarian and emergency in the development field. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome again. For our audience, if you could just take a few moments to let us know where you're tuning in from. We're just going to leave that open for a few seconds, and before we kick off with the kind of overviews that our panelists are going to present about their organizations, the context that they're operating in, and what their role is in Lebanon around gender-based violence and cash assistance. Following that, we're going to have a short conversation with them, and then we will we'll open the floor for questions from the audience before we wrap up. So if you could just take a few seconds to let us know where you're tuning in from. All right, maybe we can close the poll, please. And we'll see the results in a few. So the majority of you are calling in from Lebanon, but we also have colleagues calling in from Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Yemen, and then we have colleagues calling in from regional offices and global offices. Welcome to you all. So we're going to kick off now. We're going to start with the Danish Refugee Council. So Chantal, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I thought it would be helpful today to start us off with the definition for cash for protection that is currently applied by the protection sector in Lebanon. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in Lebanon, the protection sector has adapted the following definition for cash for protection or protection cash, which is seen as an umbrella term to describe the use of cash-based interventions to achieve a specific protection outcome. So different from other cash modalities, cash for protection seeks to reduce protection risk through the provision of cash. In Lebanon, we're currently using in the protection sector two cash models, one being emergency cash assistance, or also referred to as ECA, which is a one-off payment. The second model is the recurrent protection cash assistance, which is a cash assistance that is more sustained over a specific period of time. So providing usually multiple installments of cash to protection cases. Next slide, please. I would like to start now to also give you a brief overview of the context we are operating in. And I know my colleagues, Wissam and Celine, will then further elaborate specifically on some of the points I'm mentioning. So Lebanon has been grappling with a multifaceted crisis over the past 2 years. We've seen quite widespread economic and financial the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the Beirut port explosion in 2020. Last week, Lebanon has also declared a cholera outbreak, which is further risking to dampen the situation even more. We are currently in Lebanon experiencing extremely high levels of inflation that are driving soaring prices for basic commodities and are eroding living standards for all populations in Lebanon. Lebanon is currently having the highest food inflation globally. We're seeing enormous increases in fuel prices, telecommunication costs, rent prices, etc. So this has resulted in the multidimensional poverty rate having almost doubled in 2 years. So 2019, it was at 42%, with last year being estimated at 82%. So a lot of vulnerable families, but communities at large falling under the poverty line currently in Lebanon. Access to critical services is also continuing to deteriorate. We are having a health system that is severely impacted by the crisis following the blast, but also a lot of medical staff who have left the country. Hospitals who are struggling to operate because of the enormous fuel costs, etc. We're seeing also a lot of strikes of public service sector employees due to the declining worth of the minimum wage in Lebanon and the erosion of purchasing power for many. Provision of electricity in Lebanon is severely hampered, infrastructure collapsing as well. We also have a lot of unavailability or scarcity of goods in markets. So we have a lot of unavailable medication currently. We have seen but also this year specifically, we've seen a big increase in tensions and also against community. We're also seeing more and more reliance on harmful mechanisms that further experience
Chantal?
mechanisms are also becoming more severe. So we have cases of child labor. Yes.
I'm really sorry, but your line cut up a bit. Also, just a general note for the audience and for those calling in from Lebanon, I'm sure you're aware of the connectivity problems that we are struggling with. So apologies and yeah. So Chantal, I'm really sorry, but could you repeat the last point that you were talking about?
Sorry about that. I dropped off at the harmful coping mechanisms.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So we're seeing more and more reliance on negative, harmful coping mechanisms that further expose communities to violence and exploitation. And these coping mechanisms are increasingly driven by economic insecurity. And we also see these coping mechanisms becoming increasingly severe. So high increases in child labor, including the worst forms of child labor, increases in child marriage. I'm sure many of you have also seen the increase in dangerous onward movements with boats departing from Lebanon. People are foregoing rent payments, they're reducing food intake and accumulating debt. So that is the challenging environment we're currently operating in. DRC, specifically on GBV, is providing both prevention and response programming in Lebanon to all communities. If we go to the next slide, please. So our services include case management. We also provide individual psychosocial support, as well as emotional support groups. We integrate legal aid services into our GBV program, which includes legal counseling, but also legal representation. We also integrate protection cash, of course, into our GBV response programming. We also have community-based outreach and awareness raising and prevention activities, as well as focused psychosocial support, as well as structured GBV prevention curricula. And of course, we also provide referral services to GBV survivors or women at risk. Next slide, please. Specifically with regards to cash for protection within our GBV response. So cash for protection for us is always embedded in our GBV case management response. So we have caseworkers who identify the need for case management services through in-depth assessments, who then develop individual safety and action plans for each case that we identify. When it comes to the provision of cash assistance, the need for cash and the appropriateness of cash is identified as well by the caseworker and then included as part of an individual action plan. For each case where we consider the provision of cash, there's a specific risk assessment that is conducted to make sure that we can ensure safe access to cash and do not expose any survivor to any further harm. Decision ultimately to provide cash assistance is done by a cash panel, so it's not the caseworker deciding on the provision of cash. There's also a monitoring component to our cash assistance, where we monitor both the outcome, so the effectiveness of cash to reach protection outcomes, as well as a post-distribution monitoring survey, where we look at more the process of cash, whether it was safely accessible for survivors, etc.
Thank you, Chantal. Before I hand over to Celine, it seems that we're having a problem with the interpretation. Is this the case for everyone? Okay. All right, translation not audible. All right. We're just going to take a few seconds to see what we can do before I hand over to Celine. So Celine, just give me a few seconds, thanks.
Okay.
Very sorry, everyone. We're just having a small technical problem. Okay, I'm terribly sorry, everyone. We've had to restart one of the laptops. So in the meantime, we're just going to wait for my team to reconnect, and we'll take it from there. In the meantime, I think I'm going to take this opportunity to kind of talk a bit about the reflections that we've gotten in the past. Again, this is a webinar series. So initially we started off with Northwest Syria and Turkey. We then moved to Jordan, and today we're talking about Lebanon. And I think what's really interesting, and I feel this conversation is really going to bring out the fact that while the different countries have been dealing with similar crises, essentially there are wider environmental related aspects that kind of have bigger implications on what this means programmatically. And I think that's been the most interesting component of the conversation so far, and seeing how these things link up together. So I'm actually going to just quickly, all right, I think we're going to be able to restart right now. Again, apologies, everyone. Okay, I think we've sorted out interpretation. Can I just get a confirmation from the team? Okay, great. We're just going to restart the PowerPoint slide, and Celine will hand over to you. Thank you everyone for your patience, and apologies about the minor delay.
اوكي كسبا للوقت راح كون عم بعرض سريعا
As a matter of time, I will present the services that we offer at CAFA for GBV survivors and children. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide, please. CAFA as a support center, we perform case management. We also have a call center that manage the hotline, which we receive all the requests on that is related to violence. Perhaps there is a woman that is experiencing real-time violence. She can communicate with us via the hotline, and then we perform a company with her. We give her a safety plan, and then she will be accompanied to the police station, and then we follow up with the investigation if she needs a doctor. Also, regarding the hotline, we work on a 24/7 basis, and we can receive even news or reports about a woman who experienced violence. She can communicate with us on the hotline. Other services that are offered, we have a multi-purpose team that offer case management service, and they are multidisciplinary. We have a social, psychological specialist who offer case management services and in a holistic approach. We set the plan, and after we perform a psychological assessment for the beneficiary. This is regarding the social service. And there is also, we offer a psychological company that is offered on an individual and a collective level. We also have the legal part. You know, in Lebanon, we have the part that is related to civil affairs regarding punishment part. We direct the woman to request protection. Regarding these personal affairs, we have a team of lawyers that follow up cases regarding compensation and custody. According to the sect, as you know, in Lebanon, we have 18 sects and 15 laws, and each lady is subject to the law that applies to them. And there are courts, according to the sectarian code, that follow up the compensation and divorce. In addition to those services, for the beneficiaries, we mentioned cash assistance. Cash assistance is a need now, or a necessity, especially given the developments last 3 years, like COVID-19 and the deterioration of the economic situation and all the crises that we are passing or that we are experiencing, which changed a lot of case management or GBV case management. What I want to say that the need of cash assistance is urgent and in case management. As today, here I would like to add something here regarding the services as a support center that gives direct services or offer direct services to survivors. We also established a transitional center or temporary center to receive victims of violence who need shelters. I'm sorry, the internet. We usually transfer them to other centers for. I'm sorry. During COVID-19 and for such cases that we cannot transfer them to permanent shelters, we give them the quarantine, the 14 days. We make sure that the PCR is negative, and then we transfer them to the centers according to the criteria. These are the services that we offer, and we can also talk about that in more details.
Thank you very much, Celine. And last but not least, I'm going to hand over to Wissam to tell us a bit more about Kurras. Wissam?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chantal and Celine, for opening up the conversation around the context in Lebanon. Just not to repeat everything that's being said, I'm going to build up a little bit on the context information that you've provided. A little bit about Kurras. We're a working group, specifically Tajassud within Kurras. We're a working group that provides knowledge production and practical information specifically on trans issues. To be specific, I'm here to speak from the community perspective rather than a service provider perspective. So I think this is the wonderful thing about this panel, is that it provides both ends of the spectrum. So the context, of course, the context in Lebanon for the LGBT community in general and the trans community in specific has been extremely amplified in terms of complexities when it comes to trans individuals, specifically after the economic crisis, the exodus of the medical system, and recently what happened in June with the shrinking space and the crackdowns that happened on LGBT community. From a community perspective and from the trans community point of view, the concerns that revolve around accessing services and specifically cash assistance is how it's been tailored and how it's been done in a way that serves the mainstream recipients and not taking into account different experiences in the community for trans community, whether they're trans nationals or they're trans refugees, whether they live in the central area in Beirut, whether they live outside Beirut, whether they have capacity of mobility, because sometimes, you know, individuals who are socially differently expressed in their gender experience or their gender expression don't have a lot of margin of mobility. And also we have refugees who trans refugees who don't have necessarily IDs or documentation paper. That also mobility for them is another issue. And also the idea of defining what gender-based violence for that particular community as well, it takes a lot of difference. So when talking about systemic violence, when talking about economic violence, when talking about social violence, and also when talking about medical and legal violence and how that is also shaped. And this is something that we can also elaborate on in the upcoming conversation. Please, Chris, next slide. So the factors that increase gender-based violence, and this is something that I touched base on in a second, the increase in hate speech, racism, and violence, and that is not only specific to violence and racism towards the trans community in specific, but also on a bigger level, the hate speech towards Palestinians, the hate speech towards refugees, the speech towards forced return of refugees, and how that trickles down also on trans individuals who are very specific in their vulnerabilities and their experience. There's also the lack of safety and security that is general to the population in Lebanon, but also how does it crystallize in terms of safety and securities for individuals of the LGBT community? And what do we mean with the lack of access in two sides? How trans individuals access services, and what are the obstacles they have in accessing services, and also the availability of services recently within the current context, within the exodus of the medical staff, whether it's post the explosion and the deterioration of the medical infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, and other, and also the knowledge of people working with the trans individuals on trans-related issues. So different forms of gender-based violence. How does it take shape, and how we need to tackle each one of them. And also, when talking about the forms of support, is how the community also supports each other in terms of informal networks. Currently, specifically after what happened in the recent events with the crackdowns on these spaces, the need for constant community consultation. So how does participatory approach look like? How can it be redefined within the development and the corporate and the humanitarian aid sector? Also, how can we adapt our work? Specifically, what we've done in Kurras is that, yes, we were all about knowledge production and providing practical information, but how adapting to the world made us shift more towards advocacy, working with service providers and organizations to identify gaps, to build capacity, to also step in spaces to make sure that when it comes to working with the community, how to have a community voice within these spaces.
Thank you very much. I want to take the opportunity to remind everyone that feel free to drop in your Q&As whenever you have a question for us. And just to be mindful of the chat, some of the team members are dropping in really interesting publications that were shared by the panelists. So also take the, just make sure that you check that out. So thank you very much. Again, it's a very complex operational environment, but also for individuals as they try to navigate the complexities. And I think from everything I'm hearing, I think what the first question, I mean, kind of to unpack it with all of you is, what are the barriers that you face through your roles during program implementation? But also, how have you been working around overcoming them? Chantal, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, and there has been a lot of barriers, I think, that we've seen emerging. Some of them have already existed for a while, so we're obviously continuously trying to adapt. I think just in general, we have been seeing a really high increase in GBV incidents, so it's not necessarily a barrier, but I think, you know, it has kind of shifted our focus to more response programming in our GBV component, just to be able to respond to the increase in needs that we're seeing. Another barrier we have been consistently struggling with, and that is currently being exacerbated, is the lack or unavailability of complementary services for GBV survivors. So there's direct service provision that we can provide, but obviously in our interventions, we are also dependent on other services to be functioning and available. And we have seen really big gaps in mental health services for GBV survivors, but also very big gaps in safe shelters that are available to GBV survivors. We're trying to overcome that by closely coordinating with different service providers or development of partnerships. Obviously, we also advocate in different working groups and other coordination spaces to make these services more available. And also try to the extent possible to fundraise for integrated program responses that can better link survivors to holistic service provision. In terms of the safe shelters, we in DRC are starting up actually an emergency transitional shelter component, just to have the ability to provide that service directly to the GBV survivors in need. I think more operationally, of course, we are now dealing with the rise in telecommunication and transportation costs. And as Wissam already mentioned, this is affecting our ability to reach people, but also their ability to reach our services. So after telecommunication costs have increased, we've seen a big drop in our program hotlines and GBV hotlines, which is now slowly picking up again. But you know, accountability is extremely affected by the lack of telecommunication. So we're trying to increase our presence in the locations that we're operating in, but also trying to diversify our feedback mechanisms and program hotlines. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult in Lebanon to get toll-free hotlines. So it's not something we have yet been able to establish. We do provide cash to support transportation if a survivor is in need. We continuously try to also map new safe spaces where we can provide services in closer vicinity to the population in need. We can also provide telecommunication allowance to GBV survivors in case it's safe, and so they're able to remain in contact with their caseworker. I think another barrier that is becoming increasingly difficult is that the economic vulnerability is making it more and more difficult to achieve sustainable outcomes for GBV survivors. So oftentimes, due to economic pressures, they are forced back into abusive situations. There's very few employment opportunities, few linkages to social protection or other longer-term assistance programs or social safety nets that could enable you know, the survivor to transition into safety over the longer term. And I think that's specifically difficult as a humanitarian organization to tackle. Of course, we do referrals where we can. We try to link our internal programming to integrate economic recovery services, etc. But I think, you know, the larger absence of social protection and safety nets is making it very hard to achieve sustainable outcomes.
Thanks, Chantal. And I'm hearing about a lot of things regarding infrastructure and the environment, and you know, and the barriers that you're facing as organizations, but also individuals, and trying to build new and or build on existing solutions so that it works for everyone. Celine, maybe you can tell us a bit more about what it's been like for Kafa.
بالنسبة للجي بي في cases اللي عم
For
نشوف
GBV cases, what we witness now, especially with the deterioration of the economic situation, honestly, there is a change in the social plan. And today, the women who are able to face or to break the cycle of violence that was, doing with the case manager, now the priorities have changed for those women. Now, the women who were able to be to support their families, if she leave the house or if she took the decision to leave the house, sometimes the family or the parents, they are supportive. But now, due to the economic difficulties, the people are not able, or the parents are not able to support those women, especially if there are children, because this is an additional cost. We can also talk about the income for the household, which impacted, which changed the action plan of the beneficiary to face the violence that she experienced. Here we're talking about the women that they don't have sufficient income to live in a separate house, or like so she is dependent. Chantal also spoke about the transportation for the beneficiaries or for the survivors to come to our support center. This is also a barrier. We are trying as much as we can to fill the gap, to pay for the transportation. Also for the online case management, we tried through an application that we launched in April for that to be like a communication tool between the GBV cases and the case managers in our center. But unfortunately, even the internet now is not fulfilling the needs of the beneficiary. Also, we are paying airtime to some survivors. All of these things, or all of these matters, are new or emerging because of the economic situation. Now, the violence that we are facing or we're witnessing in the beneficiary's life, it becomes more radical or extremely radical. Now, a lot of women, they communicate with us from hospitals that she experienced violence to the extent that she had to be admitted to the hospital. We hear now about a brother who hit his center. She has been in coma for 29 days. They are calling Kafa and they are afraid of the perpetrator. So we see more radical incidents, especially in the north region. We heard about that guy who burned his wife through a gas cylinder. Even the manner that they are experiencing violence now is different. We haven't seen this before. Now, the economic situation also negatively impact the facilities or the public facilities. If the woman now wants to go and complain, they do not receive this, or they do not deal properly with that complaint. Everybody knows about 1745, which is a dedicated number for the family violence. The lady or the woman can reach that. Now, if there is no electricity, they do not answer the phone, and if they answer, if there is no a vehicle to move to the or to go to her house, they do not go to her house to see if she is experiencing violence. She even can reach the police station. The police cannot even assign a doctor to check the violence marks on her body. Now there is a lack of services that actually provide protection for women on from the legal aspect and also safety aspect. This is in addition to, sorry. No internet.
Celine?
I think she's cut.
Celine, can you hear me? Okay. There seems to be a connectivity problem. She will be back with us in a bit. Wissam, how about you share a bit from your end? Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. It's just to also echo what everyone is saying regarding how the economic crisis and how the situation generally in Lebanon is affecting everyone. It's a very stagnating situation for all governmental institutions, which we as trans individuals have to deal with a lot, whether in terms of processing our legal paper and documentation, whether is it if someone got arrested or put in jail, prosecuted for whichever reason that they've been prosecuted for, that also puts a stagnating state for the work and for the trans people to also seek protection or seek services. Additionally, within the economic situation that's been happening, with the increase in prices, with the inflation of the economy, with the deterioration of the currency, there's also the lack of access to medication. This is a barrier that we've been facing a lot with our trans peers and our trans community. There's a lack of access to medication that's not available, whether it's not being imported or they can't afford it. There's a lack of access to medical procedures that they've been facing. So this is on one hand one of the barriers that we've been facing on a institution systematic level, whether it's legal barriers or medical barriers that we've been facing. On the other end is, I would call it, organizational service provision barrier, which is it's related to service provision such as cash and voucher assistance or protection assistance or medical assistance or in that sort, but also the lack of understanding as well of trans issues by organizations. So I would dare to call it another layer of violence that the trans individual and trans community have to deal with, because they are either prohibited from using that assistance. There's no understanding of how to use that assistance. There's an intense extraction of data, and in an unethical way sometimes that could happen in promise of receiving aid or not. So that's also, safeguarding is not something that's being really well considered in these settings. And the third layer of violence that I would consider more on a community level, especially after the events that happened in June. One is the lack of safety and security in the country in general. People are being robbed, being mugged, being attacked. The other day we found a kid on a highway between Saida and Sur. So there's also the lack of safety and security when it comes to the trans community, of whether wanting to be mobile or wanting to seek assistance or wanting to use any channels of referral that exist, which are not quite very active in terms of how referral is happening in the country and how the follow-up happens within these settings. So these are mainly some of the barriers that we face. We can go on and on about a lot of things. How are these things being tackled? Mainly, I emphasize a lot on creating and co-creating partnerships with our peers, with our allies, with our community-based organizations. There's a lot of informal networking and a lot of informal channels of support that we do among each other. It's a lot of information sharing because the motto of nothing for us without us is very, very relevant in this case, that nothing should be done for the trans community without the trans community. So with this being said, a lot of engagement with partnerships and being present in spaces. a lot of capitalizing on community support, and looking as well with our partners or with our peers and our community to see how also humanitarian work and humanitarian aid can be shaped in a way that really benefits the trans community instead of being like one size fits all. It's also looking at the particular experiences of that community and how our aid, our support, and our also information sharing and setting up priorities can be done in a participatory and consultative way.
Thanks, Wissam. Celine, welcome back. I know that there's some internet issues. Would you like to continue off in terms of barriers before we move to the next question?
سوري راح عند الانترنت.
I'm sorry, I was cut. Briefly, I wanted to speak about violence that became more extreme in at this stage, and the difficulties to reach the services because of the security and economic and legal situation that we are experiencing. Thank you so much.
So we've been hearing about the barriers, the challenges, the complexities that are developing and changing that you continuously need to revisit and reevaluate to make sure that it's appropriate for the people that you're trying to reach. So reflecting on all of these things, but also what you guys are working towards, how do you think we can improve the awareness of the protection services that are available to GBV survivors? Chantal, maybe I'll hand over to you to start.
Yeah, sure. And I think it links to a lot of, the mitigation measures I talked about before on how we're responding to these challenges. So I think it's extremely important to be present in communities, make safe spaces available to communities in close vicinity as well, so they don't have to travel for miles and miles just to reach services. I think we can also think about expanding our entry points for dissemination of information around existing services or increased use of awareness raising sessions, but maybe also mainstream this into schools or health facilities so that we have visibility of services across multi-sectors, that link to GBV cases. I think coordination is obviously extremely important as well. I think we need to have updated mapping of services that also include maybe more national or local service providers. Extremely important also to, of course, work on updated referral pathways and that everyone in the response has access to that information. But again, going out of maybe the more traditional big INGO actors, but actively engaged community-based organizations or civil society organizations in the provision of that information as well. And lastly, maybe also to make the feedback mechanisms more accessible, specifically related to the telecommunication challenges we've been speaking about. So thinking of other ways for people to be able to reach out, maybe using more WhatsApp or establishing physical help desks. That can be done not only in safe spaces, but in community centers, etc.
Thanks, Chantal. And a lot of interesting points to pick up on, and I'll pick your brains in a bit. Celine, what do you think we can do?
نحن بالنسبة للوضع الحالي
regarding the current situation, how we trying to adapt by intervening with the cases, we emphasize on the psychological and social part. Through this intervening, there is a lot of deep work, because in the legal part we have difficulties, and on the legal aspect there is accompanying for each case. via the lawyer. And if we have to meet the judge, we meet the judge to follow up with those cases. It's right that the system is disrupted, but through communication and through relationships, relationships that we are building with all the referring systems, we try as much as we can to assist the beneficiaries. This is regarding the adaptation of the current situation.
I'm hearing from you safe spaces, communication, but creativity in how we expand these solutions, remapping and sharing potential developments and services, either positively or negatively, either available or not. Wissam, what do you think we can do?
Thank you, Chris. I think one of the things one of the many things that we can think about is also the coordination that happens between the community and community-based organizations and also international organizations. Those between setting up the guidelines of protection and setting up the guidelines of providing aid, but also how can it be custom-made or somehow tailored towards the community of concern and how it can respond to each priority and each issue. This is on one hand, which means also conducting a lot of community consultation, conducting a lot of work with the community, including the community in how we design the project. And I know this is a fancy thing we say in the international organization, so this is removing my Kuras hat and putting my development hat. We talk a lot about participatory approach, and we talk a lot about community accountability and community consultation, but what does that actually mean indeed in settings and within a crisis such as this crisis? And also another thing I could would be also happy to see is working more towards the ethics of providing these services, whether ethics in terms of how we're providing these services, whether how we're setting up and designing these services, and also how are we working with our staff closely to ensure that ethics and guidelines and inclusion of these communities is being included. Hello?
Yes, thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Well,
we can. Your voice was just a bit low, but then you spoke a bit louder.
Because I think from the chat they're saying that I'm not. They can't.
It was just about speaking up, not can't hear. You're good.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, so the more you talk to us about the situation, the more questions that come to mind. But at the end of the day, cash is a modality to provide assistance, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not a solution to everything. And I just want to take this opportunity maybe to look at where cash wasn't appropriate for a GBV survivor. So maybe if we can hear a quick example from each one of you. Chantal, anything from your end that you can share with us?
Sure, and completely agree with what you just said. It is not a silver bullet, and I think, it's not really effective or appropriate for any GBV survivor. I think for us, what we're seeing where cash is definitely not appropriate, or there are certain risks linked to it, is that when cash could actually contribute to prolonging a situation of abuse. So for example, GBV survivors where property owners are perpetrators, and we would understand there's a high likelihood of that cash being used to pay rents, which would, leave a survivor in a continuous cycle of violence. There's also risks to providing cash to GBV survivors who are still living together with their abusers. So we need to understand, is the provision of cash actually going to expose the survivor to more risks or more violence. So we have to be very careful, I think, when we provide cash to GBV survivors, and this needs to be assessed on an individual case-by-case basis. But for me, these are the two types of situations where we definitely are very careful to providing cash.
Thanks, Chantal. And yeah, couldn't agree more. Celine, what about you? What have you seen from the cases?
بالإضافة للي قلته أوقات كتير
In addition to what you said,
أوقات كتير ما بيكون في
a lot of times that
ما بيكون في يعني كريتير التحويل على مراكز إيواء
there is no criteria to refer to center. Oh, so she doesn't fit in the criteria. Thus, we give cash assistance until she finds. So there is a difficulty to find. Now we're talking about long-term services. When you give assistance for the rent to be independent, on the basis there are no job opportunity, and if she finds an opportunity, the income is too low. So if she wants to work to earn an income to pay the rent, she cannot survive for the whole month. And there are cases that they have mental health issues. Those people, there is no body or authority that actually care for them. So the people who take medication, they cannot go to shelters if they are GBV cases. So this is a gap. So if we give one time as cash assistance, so if we give cash assistance, we don't have enough resources to assist those people on the long run. So this is a problem.
We might have to respond to an emergency GBV case, but it doesn't mean that the problem is short-term, right? It's something that needs a holistic, longer-term approach beyond the emergency that happens. Wissam, what about you?
I think my perspective will be a little bit different. I think in terms of not the situation, whether it was suitable or not, I think the delivery method was not suitable in terms of whether this person is able to cash a check or take a payment from the bank. And considering all the restrictions that exist now on the banking and financial system in Lebanon, and considering also the particularity of trans individuals with their documentation. Some of them don't have documentation, some of them don't have documentations that look like them. So that also something to factor in when doing cash and voucher assistance. When doing a training, we talked about transportation as well. Sometimes trans individuals go to the bank and have to take out the money from the bank approved by, and then this is an entire mess in itself. That's an entire sense of bias as well in itself in the bank. So I would say that it's not that the cash wasn't suitable at that time. I would say it's also the delivery method and how suitable it is for these individuals.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you all for sharing these different examples. So I think just bouncing off everything that we've been talking about, what do you think are the key considerations when we're designing CVA programs for gender-based violence survivors? What are the common fault lines or blind spots where practitioners fall short in safeguarding within these, when planning all of these things? Chantal, maybe we can start with you again.
Yes, sure. And I think my points will speak a lot to what Wissam was just saying. So within our own programming, I guess our eligibility criteria are always linked to the protection risks. So that is usually our entry point. And we do individual assessments for each case And as you were saying before, cash is only one modality we can use in our response. And I think whatever modality we choose to provide assistance, obviously the priority needs to be first and foremost the safety of the survivor. And I think that's something we need to consider, whether we provide assistance through cash, direct service provision, or in any other form. So I think it's extremely important in order to safeguard, to understand these risks related to the provision of cash, and specifically to the individual situation of the survivor, but also to the delivery mechanism per se, so that we can ensure safe access. And it's very important to have a nuanced understanding of different access barriers survivors may have. And I think here what Wissam mentioned was extremely important. So if there's also not this awareness or knowledge amongst humanitarian staff that, for example, transgender people will struggle to get cash assistance through a financial service provider or at a bank, then that's where we are really, risking to do harm. So I think we need to factor in intersecting vulnerabilities of GBV survivors linked to their specific circumstances, but also their locations. If they're refugees without papers, are they, in need to cross a checkpoint to access a financial service provider? So all of these things we try to factor in when we make the decision on whether to provide cash, but also what delivery mechanism we choose. So we tailor it based on the specific case. So we, for example, use both financial service provider, or we provide also cash in envelope. That's mostly relevant when it's an extremely urgent case, or where there's any other access barriers for the person to go through a financial service provider. And then I think to properly safeguard, it's important also to put effective monitoring mechanisms in place. So monitoring the provision of assistance, both outcome, but also process, but also making sure that people receiving cash are aware of the ability to communicate back to DRC if they have a complaint, if they were put at risk during the assistance, etc. So I think also extremely important to effectively safeguard people we're trying to assist.
Thank you, Chantal. Many excellent points raised in terms of factoring in identity related, but also geographic related, and components that we need to make sure that we're looking at. Celine, what do you think we should do better?
كل اللي ذكروه عم نواجهه، بالإضافة لليوم
I think
تذكير
we are facing everything they mentioned before, especially the closure of financial institutions, and especially now after the strike, when they reopened, now you have to schedule an appointment to enter the bank, and that increased the difficulties that are faced by the survivors. As they mentioned, it should be the process of providing cash assistance could be eased, especially via an envelope. There is more than one specialist that is following up the process, and therefore there is a need to provide this financial assistance. So facilitating the delivery of cash assistance to the GBV survivor is fundamental, because currently the banks are tightening up. Now you cannot access the bank without an appointment, and also the treatment with the people is very bad.
Wissam, what do you think we really have to consider when we talk about GBV and CVA?
I mean, I feel like the problems are very common across across all the work that we do, in terms of whether dealing with organizations or dealing with staff or dealing with the system itself, banking system or not. But I would say, just maybe from a technical level, is the risk of transfers that go unnoticed by whether between donors and organizations themselves, or between donors and the community representatives, or whoever is taking, whoever is leading on these project. I would say also part of the safeguarding and part of the safeguarding work that Chantal mentioned is also blackmailing that happens, and the extractive approach that some NGO staff usually lead on, especially when dealing with extremely vulnerable communities. And we talk about it all the time. We talk about it whether we're dealing with refugees, whether we're dealing with trans community, whether we're dealing with children. And yeah, a big part of CP is making sure that our PSEA is in place to make sure that children are being protected properly and not being used for that. So I would say this is one of the things to take into consideration. It also to take into account as well capacity building for staff, how to make sure the staff is well equipped, and we're not talking only program staff. We're talking about staff who work in service centers as well, who are, for example, who will need to receive the beneficiaries or the people from the door to the desk job, who registers people's names, to up until the highest level of the organization. Also, how to sensitize trans issues across and trans identities across staff people. And also within the design, how to also factoring in criteria of cash and voucher assistance, but also how to redefine vulnerability as well outside the rigid structure of the international guideline. Because we work in crisis, we work in contexts that are extremely violent, but also at the same time we still look at it from a very shallow perspective. So how can that also tackle different identities and different gender expressions within these contexts? Thank you.
Thank you. And again, excellent points raised, which leads me to my next question, and building off of everything that you're talking about. Across the conversation so far, you've all been talking to me about the need for a holistic approach, for the importance of service provision, linking to CVA and GBV program models. So for example, you were talking about psychosocial support, we were talking about legal services. From your experiences, what have you found to be the best practice of these elements when designing a program or working through a program? Chantal, maybe you can tell us a bit from DRC's perspective what that means.
Yes, definitely. And for any of our GBV interventions, we do try to provide holistic services. I think there's no way around that if we want to restore the protective environment of a survivor. And again, I think here it's also important to understand that cash is a modality and it's a very small component when it comes to designing effective GBV program models. And I think cash can facilitate access to some complementary services, but the cash cannot replace the quality or the availability of the services. So when you're operating in a context where these services are collapsing, there's often also not, a good use of cash because it's very limited in what you can achieve through cash interventions. So yes, in DRC, even the provision of cash is kind of tied to the provision of case management services. I think that's extremely important to be able to effectively monitor the risks as well of the assistance on a survivor. And then within case management, as I explained before, we do provide direct services in the form of psychosocial support, but then usually our action plans contain multiple service provisions, which we link survivors to through referrals. And I think, you know, that is needed to have that holistic type of intervention in order to work on multiple issues that are affected by GVB. So not only mental health, but also physical health, creating a more supportive network or community support system, linking them up to more longer term assistance, etc. Yeah.
Thanks, Chantal. Celine, over to you.
يعني نحن بنرجع بنعيد المساعدة.
Okay, I need to repeat that the cash assistance is essential to achieve the action plan that is set with the survivor. In many places or in many times, we set the plan that we are executing with the beneficiary. The barrier is achieving with achieving the action plan is the financial part. And also I want to indicate to you a very important point that even cash assistance does not have the same value, because you can see the dollar is increasing. So the cash value last year, it gives you, more return, but now more than this year or even more than this month. So now in the project, we set an amount, but when we want to execute the project, everything is changed. Like the increased costs of the telecommunication and the transportation, those matters are rapidly changing or continuously changing. So I don't know if with this component, I don't know if we can find a solution for this component. It's especially given the changing economic situation that we're experiencing.
It just continues to show that there are so many things beyond the immediate programs that are impacting how we do this. Wissam, what do you think are some of the best practices for these elements?
Sorry, I just want to make sure you're hearing me properly. Is that good? I mean, again, not to repeat everything everyone's saying, and I feel like we're all we go through the same thing in terms of difficulties and best practices in this. One of the things that I would say as a best practice is how to be rapidly adaptable. Adaptability is really key in these circumstances, especially when dealing with emergency situations, especially when dealing with a crisis like this. When there's a fluctuation in the currency, when there's like restrictions. When there are restrictions in banking systems, how to be adaptable and how to be flexible in terms of how to work with the community. Another thing is one of the best practices was continuous community consultation and continuous consultation in terms of allowing the community to decide sort of what are the best conditions for them, like who is able to take money from the bank, who is able to take money, or who is able to go and receive a service at home, or who is able to go actually access service at clinic or in a medical center. And I think also providing that form of adaptability and flexibility as well has been quite a lessons learned for all of us. There's also continuous updating for mappings and service providers, and continue that knowledge exchange among the community as well has been quite valuable in terms of creating that informal network of support between trans individuals among each other. So these are just highlights of what I think quite in the past.
So looking forward, what do you think are the key components of an enabling environment that would contribute positively to the ability of all of these efforts to address gender-based violence, but also to improve the effectiveness of gender-based violence support through cash assistance? Chantal, what do you think?
I think that, currently the response in Lebanon is shifting more to response services, and I think that's extremely critical. But then I think to build a more protective environment, we should also not lose sight of prevention activities as well as system building, without which I don't think we will get to creating a more protective environment for survivors. So I think as INGO specifically, we should also not be creating parallel structures in the environments we're operating in. So it's extremely important that local systems are strengthened so they can respond to the needs of GBV survivors. So for example, making sure CMR services are available in public health centers, training staff on how to handle GBV disclosure and cases. So I think obviously in Lebanon, there would also need to be more broader legal reforms that could support the protective environment of women, but GBV survivors as well. I think abortion in case of rape is still illegal. Intimate partner rape, I think, is still unpunishable by law as well. And I think as long as these legal barriers exist, GBV survivors are not going to be able to have access to justice, which is, I think, an important aspect in the healing process of a survivor as well. And then I think what was already mentioned as well as a lot is that we need to be able to link survivors to more longer term assistance. So thinking about nexus programming, how can we work on economic empowerment of women? How can we break down barriers of access to the job market for women, etc., to really be able to connect them to more sustainable solutions.
Thanks, Chantal. Celine, what do you think are the enabling environments?
أنا بدي أضيف شغلة بالنسبة لل
I would like to add here. We need to talk more about these topics. And already there was a lobbying of the public opinion regarding issues related to GBV cases. Now we can sensitize more emphasis on this topic. As CAFA, and through social media, we launch awareness campaign and advocacy campaigns on these issues. So we create more awareness on resisting GBV and how to provide the service in an easy manner for the survivor through the application or through the social media platforms. And also the service or the centers that women could maybe reach to, like police stations. You see, in CAFA, previously we were training the security forces on how to receive survivors of GBV and how to deal with them and how they can be referred to specialized centers. So those are very important aspects, and given the improvement of the situation, we can maybe go back to continue those training in all centers that can be reached by women to if there was a spotting of
Thank you,
violence.
Last but not least, Wissam, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Salim and Chantal again. What I think is just to create an enabling environment, we need to look at it from multiple layers. One, on an institutional, bigger governmental level, Also on an organization level, when we're talking about organizations and service providers and institutions that work directly with the community, and then also, of course, looking at the community itself. Considering that we're in a mode of crisis, so the first thing I would think about in creating an enabling environment is to how can we work with the system that already exists, and that working and capitalizing on the existing structure, looking at the blind spots within the system and the structure, and how we can also fill in that gap and work within these available frameworks, because I don't think there will be any legal or medical change in the framework anytime soon in Lebanon. I hope I'm wrong. Please, I'll be happy to be proved wrong. But within what we have existing now, I think we need to work with what we have and how we can also utilize these existing tools and these existing structures into supporting the communities of concern. And the blind spots, I would say also not within the institutions and governmental institutions per se, but I would talk more about NGOs and INGOs working with the trans community and working on providing services for vulnerable communities, is to look at their blind spots. Where do they have shortcomings? Where do they need to be working more towards accountability, working more towards including the community and reach out to the community in that inclusion across the program cycle, whether from design up until evaluation. And lastly, also support and work towards community-led solutions. And that also, again, re-emphasizing the idea of participatory approach and co-creating partnerships across all stakeholders.
I mean, it would be ideal if we were able to do all of this. And I think the first step is all of us agreeing on what do we need to move forward with, how do we collaborate, how can we support each other as we address the immediate needs, but also looking forward. Looking at the time, we have 2 minutes left. But a final question, and I'm going to give you all no more than 20 seconds. So what are your top recommendations and for who? Chantal, kick us off.
Yalla. I think to practitioners, to make sure that at least cash for protection is embedded within ideally case management response or within a holistic service provision framework. And then maybe to donors, the importance to continue to fund both response and prevention programming, as well as integrated programming and support efforts for system strengthening as well.
Celine, over to you, your 20 seconds.
Okay, أنا بس
All right.
بدي كريكومنديشن
As a recommendation I would like to emphasize on the importance of cash assistance in case management or GBV case management. It is very essential. Not all the donors are not able to fund all the projects, but I would like also to emphasize on the self-care of the staff, especially in this environment that we're living in, who actually experience stress and they need psychological support and healthcare to be able to provide the service in an efficient way.
Yes, for service providers and international organizations is just to work mostly towards capacity building of staff and their internal structure, and also reaching out to grassroots communities and community-based organizations. As for donors, there's a long list, but I can think of a little bit of less rigidity in financial guidelines, specifically because someone mentioned, what do we do if the donor doesn't allow for that flexibility to provide cash at hand? And I think within that structure, and something that the country has been struggling with for the past 2 years since the banking crash in Lebanon, is how we can be less rigid and more inclusive as well in terms of financial guidelines on how to include more feedback from different stakeholders.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to everyone that has joined us today. First of all, panelists, thank you. You guys have been awesome. Just a quick reminder to everyone that there's a virtual workshop happening tomorrow. Details are in the chat. Please join us. It's going to be very interesting. There's going to be simultaneous translation in Arabic, Turkish, and English. Besides that, have a great afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today.